May 5, 2021. In a hospice bed in Weymouth, Massachusetts, the same working-class town where his life began, George Jacob Young is dying at the age of 78 from liver and kidney failure. Outside, life continues normally, but inside that small room, the man once responsible for moving an estimated 85% of the cocaine entering the United States takes his final breath. There are no bodyguards, no wealth, no empire, only hospice workers and silence. The man who once moved alongside Pablo Escobar's global operation now dies alone, broke, and forgotten by the world he once helped flood with narcotics. This is the story of how a boy from a quiet Boston suburb became one of the most important figures in the Medellin cartel's American pipeline, and how he ultimately lost everything. George Jacob Young was born on August 6, 1942, in Weymouth, Massachusetts, a modest blue-collar town south of Boston. His father worked in the heating oil business, and his mother managed the home. Money was always tight, and George grew up watching his father struggle financially while his mother left and returned more than once. From an early age, he formed a determination to escape poverty at any cost. He was an average student, a football player, and outwardly unremarkable. But behind that normal exterior was a growing ambition that would eventually define his life. After a short time at the University of Southern Mississippi, he drifted west in 1967, landing in Manhattan Beach, California at the age of 24, without direction but with growing curiosity about money and opportunity. What he discovered in California changed everything. Marijuana was abundant, cheap, and in high demand on the East Coast. George quickly realized the profit gap between California's supply and Massachusetts' demand was enormous. He began small, transporting marijuana in suitcases, then escalating to more sophisticated methods such as hollowed surfboards and hidden compartments in vehicles driven across the country. By the late 1960s, he was even working with commercial flight attendants who carried duffel bags filled with marijuana on domestic flights. The scale of the operation expanded rapidly. By 1971, George was coordinating airplane shipments of hundreds of pounds of marijuana from Mexico into the United States, making more money in a week than most people made in years. However, success came with increasing risk. By 1974, George was arrested in Chicago with a large shipment of marijuana and faced serious federal charges. After briefly skipping bail, he was eventually captured and sentenced to federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut. It was there that his life changed direction permanently. Inside the prison, he met Carlos Leda, a young Colombian-German inmate with radical ideas and deep connections to emerging drug networks in Colombia. Despite their differences, the two formed a partnership built on opportunity rather than trust. Leda introduced George to a concept that would redefine global drug trafficking: cocaine distribution on an industrial scale. The profit margins were staggering, with cocaine costing a fraction in Colombia of what it sold for in the United States. Together, they developed the early blueprint for what would become a massive international smuggling operation. After their release in 1976, they quickly began building routes between Colombia, the Bahamas, and the United States. Leda eventually established Norman's Cay, a remote island in the Bahamas that was transformed into a heavily controlled transshipment hub for cocaine trafficking. Aircraft flew in from Colombia, refueled and unloaded on the island, and smaller planes carried shipments into the United States. For a time, the operation functioned with near impunity, supported by corruption, intimidation, and the sheer difficulty of enforcement across international waters. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, George Jung had become a Central American connection within the Medellin cartel's distribution network. It is estimated that during this period, his operation was responsible for as much as 85% of all cocaine entering the United States. At its peak, he was earning extraordinary sums of money, sometimes up to $100,000 a day. Wealth accumulated faster than it could be managed. Cash was stored in houses, vehicles, and storage units. He lived between multiple locations, moved constantly, and operated in a world where violence, paranoia, and excess were routine. During this time, George met Mirtha Calderon, a Cuban-Colombian woman who moved in similar circles. Their relationship quickly escalated into marriage in 1977, and on August 1, 1978, their daughter Christina Sunshine Jung was born. For a brief period, George experienced a sense of stability, balancing family life with one of the most lucrative criminal operations in the world. However, addiction, instability, and pressure from the drug trade quickly began to erode that stability. Both George and Mirtha developed serious cocaine addictions, and their relationship became increasingly volatile. Violence, arguments, and mistrust became routine, even as their financial success continued. At the same time, internal shifts within the Medellin organization began to weaken George's position. Carlos Leda became increasingly unstable and politically radical, attracting unwanted attention from authorities. Pablo Escobar began restructuring the cartel's operations to reduce dependence on intermediaries. Simultaneously, law enforcement pressure intensified across the Caribbean and the Bahamas. Norman's Cay, once a secure hub, came under increasing scrutiny, and the network that had supported George's rise began to collapse. Mirtha eventually filed for divorce, and by 1984, their marriage was officially over. George's access to large-scale operations diminished rapidly. As the cartel evolved, George was pushed out of the central structure and forced into smaller, less stable operations. He continued to move cocaine on a reduced scale, primarily through old contacts in California and the United States. However, the era of massive distribution was over. Law enforcement surveillance increased, and arrests within his network became more frequent. In 1987, Carlos Leda was captured and extradited to the United States. Facing his own legal pressure, George testified against him in court. Leda was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. While this decision secured George temporary relief from prosecution, it also permanently severed remaining ties to his former partners and placed him in danger within criminal circles. By the early 1990s, George's operations had collapsed entirely. In 1994, he was arrested in Kansas while transporting a large cocaine shipment weighing over 1,700 pounds. He pleaded guilty to multiple conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. He was incarcerated at Otisville Federal Correctional Institution in New York, where he spent decades reflecting on his life, writing letters, and attempting to reconnect with his daughter. During his imprisonment, George's story became widely known through the release of the film Blow in 2001, in which his life was dramatized and partially romanticized. Actor Johnny Depp portrayed him, and George himself participated in interviews and consultations during production. However, the film's popularity did not translate into reconciliation with his daughter. Christina, raised largely away from her father's influence, struggled with the legacy of his actions and maintained distance for many years. Although they eventually reconnected in limited ways, their relationship remained complicated and incomplete. After serving nearly 2 decades, George was released from prison in 2014 at the age of 71. He returned to a world that had moved on without him. Financially broke and physically weakened, he entered a halfway house in San Diego and began giving interviews and public appearances to support himself. He briefly reunited with Christina and met his grandson, marking one of the few moments of personal reconciliation in his later life. However, his health continued to decline, and he struggled with the consequences of decades of drug use and imprisonment. In 2016, he was briefly returned to custody for a parole violation, but was released again in 2017. He then returned to Massachusetts, living quietly in the town he had left nearly 6 decades earlier. His final years were marked by illness, reflection, and a gradual withdrawal from public life. On May 5, 2021, George Young died in hospice care in Weymouth, the same town where his story began. The aftermath of his life reflects the broader collapse of the network he once helped build. Carlos Leda eventually served decades in prison before being released and deported to Germany in 2020. Pablo Escobar was killed in 1993 in Medellin. Martha Jung overcame addiction and rebuilt her life independently. Christina Sunshine Jung became a mother and entrepreneur, building her own identity separate from her father's legacy. Many lower-level associates either served prison sentences or disappeared into obscurity as the drug trade evolved. George Young's story ultimately reveals the structure behind the myth of the cocaine trade. He was not a cartel leader, but a highly effective intermediary who connected supply to demand on a massive scale. His success depended on networks larger than himself, and his downfall came when those networks no longer needed him. The system he helped build did not collapse with him, it simply moved on. In the end, George Young's life was defined by extremes: immense wealth and complete poverty, global influence and total isolation, brief family intimacy and decades of separation. He helped shape one of the largest drug pipelines in history, only to spend his final years removed from the world he once controlled.
His death in a small Massachusetts room closed the final chapter on a life built inside and ultimately destroyed by the machinery of the global drug trade.
If you want more deep dives into hidden worlds like this, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.